He once swore he would destroy her family. But 7 years later, he would come face to face with the one thing he could never control. The room was wrapped in quiet elegance, the kind that only existed in places where money spoke louder than people ever needed to. Crystal glasses catching the warm glow of chandelier light. Polished marble floors reflecting every careful step taken by those who belonged and those who simply served. And at the center of it all stood a boy no older than 7, his small frame straight, his dark eyes steady in a way that didn't belong to someone his age, dressed in a simple navy blazer slightly too large for his shoulders, as if it had been borrowed for an occasion bigger than him. Yet somehow he wore it like it belonged, like confidence had stitched it to his skin. And when he spoke, the room didn't just listen. It stilled, conversations fading into nothing as if pulled away by an invisible current, because there was something in his voice, soft but unwavering, that demanded attention without asking for it. And across the room, standing near a long table lined with untouched champagne flutes, Victor Castellano paused mid-motion, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of his glass, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed, locked onto the boy with a focus that made everything else irrelevant. Because Victor was a man who had built his world on control, on precision, on knowing exactly how every moment would unfold before it even began. Yet something about this child disrupted that certainty in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the confidence. It wasn't just the calm. It was something deeper, something that tugged at a memory he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. And as the boy continued speaking, explaining something simple, something innocent, the kind of small truth only a child would say out loud, Victor felt something shift beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable, like a crack forming in a foundation he thought was unbreakable. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't observing from above. He wasn't calculating or predicting outcomes. He was simply watching, drawn in by something he didn't understand. While on the far side of the room, standing just outside the circle of attention, Naomi Carter remained still, her posture composed, her hands gently clasped in front of her, as if holding herself together with quiet strength, her dark eyes never leaving the boy, not with fear, not with anxiety, but with something far more powerful, certainty. Because she had lived every moment that led to this one. Every sacrifice, every silent night, every decision made when no one was there to see it. And as Victor's gaze slowly shifted from the boy to her, recognition didn't hit him like a storm. It crept in, slow and deliberate, threading through his thoughts with an unsettling clarity. Because somewhere deep inside, past the years he had buried, past the choices he had justified, there was a voice reminding him of something he had said once, something he had meant, something he had believed he could enforce without consequence. And as the boy turned slightly, the light catching his face just enough to reveal a detail Victor couldn't ignore, the room seemed to hold its breath, not because anyone understood what was happening, but because something unseen had changed, something irreversible had begun. And for a man who had spent his life commanding silence, Victor Castellano found himself standing inside it, unable to speak, unable to move, as the past he thought he controlled quietly stepped into the present. And for the first time, he realized that some things don't disappear, they wait. Victor did not move immediately, but something in his chest tightened in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a memory pressing against a locked door. And as the boy finished speaking, a few polite murmurs returned to the room, soft applause following, as if people were trying to recover from a moment they did not fully understand. Yet Victor remained still, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the hosts, but on the child who now stepped back with quiet composure. And it was in that small movement, the way the boy adjusted his sleeve, the way he glanced briefly toward the woman standing at the edge of the room, that something deeper began to settle into place. Because Victor had spent years reading people, decoding gestures, understanding the unspoken language of power and intention, and what he saw now was not performance. It was instinct, something natural, something inherited, and his grip on the glass tightened slightly before he set it down without a sound, his attention narrowing as if the entire room had faded into nothing but two figures standing on opposite ends of a truth he had not yet fully grasped. And then he began to walk, slow, deliberate steps across polished marble, each one measured yet carrying a weight that those nearby could feel without knowing why. Conversations softened again as people instinctively made space for him. Because when Victor Castellano moved, people noticed, even when they pretended not to, and Naomi saw him coming long before he reached her, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but her eyes holding something that was not fear, not anymore, something that had been shaped over years of quiet endurance. And when he finally stopped in front of her, there was no greeting, no polite acknowledgement, only a silence that stretched between them, heavy with everything that had once been said and everything that had been left unsaid. And for a moment, Victor simply looked at her, truly looked, not as a passing presence in his home, not as someone beneath his attention, but as a person whose existence now demanded recognition. And in that stillness, fragments returned to him, a voice from years ago, sharp and absolute, words spoken without hesitation, without doubt, words that had carried the weight of his authority at the time. And as they echoed in his mind, they no longer felt like power, they felt like something else entirely, something he could not easily define. And then his eyes shifted slightly, drawn once again to the boy who now stood beside a group of adults, answering a question with quiet confidence, his voice calm, his posture composed. And Victor noticed the smallest detail, the way the boy's brow furrowed slightly when he thought, the way his gaze held steady instead of dropping. And it was in that moment that the distance between past and present began to collapse, because there are truths that do not need to be spoken out loud. They reveal themselves in pieces, in gestures, in echoes of something once known, and Victor felt it, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, undeniable certainty forming beneath the surface. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of the sharp edge that once defined it, as he asked a question that seemed simple to anyone listening, but carried a weight only Naomi could fully understand. What is his name? And Naomi did not hesitate, did not look away, did not soften her gaze as she answered, her voice calm, unwavering. Ethan. And for a brief second, something flickered across Victor's face, something almost imperceptible, but real, because names have a way of anchoring truth, of making something intangible suddenly solid. And as the sound of that name settled into the space between them, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition, with consequence, with the quiet beginning of something neither of them could undo. And across the room, Ethan glanced over once more, his eyes meeting Victor's without hesitation, without fear, and in that steady gaze, Victor Castellano felt something shift that he could not command, could not control, and for the first time in years, he understood what it meant to stand in front of a truth that did not belong to his world, but had the power to change it completely. The name lingered longer than it should have, not because it was unusual, but because of the way it connected to something Victor could not yet fully face. And as Naomi held his gaze without flinching, there was a quiet understanding between them that this moment was not accidental, that it had been building for years in ways neither of them could stop. And Victor's eyes shifted once more toward Ethan, studying him now with a sharper focus, noticing the details he would have dismissed before. The structure of his face, the calm intelligence behind his expression, the way he carried himself with a natural authority that did not come from wealth or privilege, but from something deeper, something that could not be taught. And for a brief second, Victor saw a reflection he recognized, not in appearance alone, but in presence. And that realization did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with resistance, because accepting it meant reopening a part of his past he had deliberately buried. And as the room slowly returned to its rhythm, voices rising again, laughter attempting to reclaim the space, Victor remained anchored in that moment, his mind pulling him backward whether he wanted it or not, back to a time when everything had seemed simpler because he had chosen not to question it, back to a quiet hallway in his estate, where polished floors stretched endlessly beneath soft golden light, and a young woman had stood in front of him, her hands trembling but her voice steady, carrying news that should have meant nothing to him, but somehow had disrupted the order he relied on. And he remembered the way he had responded, not with hesitation, not with consideration, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that came from believing power could shape outcomes without consequence. And now, standing here 7 years later, that same certainty felt distant, almost foreign, because the result of that moment was no longer abstract. It was standing across the room, breathing, speaking, existing in a way that could not be undone, and Victor exhaled slowly, a controlled motion that did little to settle the shift happening beneath the surface, while Naomi remained composed. But inside, she felt the weight of years pressing forward, not as fear, but as truth finally stepping into the light, because she remembered that night just as clearly, the silence that followed his words, the way the air had seemed to close around her, as if even the walls understood what had been said, and she had walked away from that moment carrying more than just a decision. She had carried a promise to herself, one that had shaped every day that followed, every sacrifice, every quiet victory no one else had witnessed. And now, as she stood in the same space as the man who had once believed he could erase her future with a sentence, she felt no need to speak beyond what was necessary, because some truths do not need to be argued. They simply exist, undeniable, incomplete. And as Victor finally looked back at her, there was something different in his expression, something that had not been there before, not weakness, not regret, but recognition, the kind that does not ask for permission. It arrives whether you are ready or not. And as Ethan's voice carried lightly through the room once more, answering another question with that same calm clarity, Victor understood something he had never needed to understand before, that there are moments in life where control does not belong to the one with power, but to the one who chose to endure. And for the first time, he was no longer the one defining what came next, because what stood before him was not a situation to manage. It was a truth to face, and the silence between him and Naomi was no longer empty. It was filled with everything that had been set in motion 7 years ago, now returning with a quiet certainty that could not be ignored. The distance between them no longer felt like space. It felt like time layered thick between two people who had lived entirely different versions of the same moment. And Victor's gaze did not leave Naomi, as if looking away would allow the truth to rearrange itself into something easier to accept. But it did not, because reality had already taken form in the shape of a 7-year-old boy who stood across the room speaking with a quiet confidence that did not ask for approval. And Victor took a slow breath, one that carried more weight than any decision he had made in years, because for the first time, this was not about business, not about strategy, not about control. It was about consequence, and consequences did not negotiate. They simply arrived, and Naomi could see it happening, not in a dramatic shift, not in a sudden collapse of authority, but in something far more subtle. The recalibration of a man who had always believed he stood above the outcomes of his own choices, and now stood face to face with one he could not dismiss. And as Ethan finished his conversation and began walking toward Naomi, his small steps steady against the polished floor, the world seemed to narrow into a single line connecting all three of them, past and present, meeting in a way that could not be undone. And when the boy reached her side, he looked up with a simple, trusting expression, the kind that only exists when a child feels safe. And Naomi's hand rested gently on his shoulder, a quiet gesture that carried years of protection, of sacrifice, of decisions made in silence. And Victor watched that moment closely, because in that touch, he saw something he had never had to understand before, the kind of strength that does not come from power, but from choosing to endure without it. And Ethan's eyes shifted toward Victor, curious but unafraid, studying him in the same way Victor had studied him earlier, as if trying to place a feeling he could not yet name. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because some connections do not begin with words, they begin with recognition that exists beneath language. And Victor felt it again, stronger this time, not as a question, but as something forming into certainty, and he lowered himself slightly, just enough to meet the boy's eye level, a movement that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else in the room, but carried a quiet shift in posture, a step away from distance, away from authority, towards something he had never needed to approach before. And when he spoke, his voice was controlled, but softer than it had been moments ago, asking a question that carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. "Do you enjoy speaking in front of people?" And Ethan nodded, without hesitation, his voice calm as he answered that he liked explaining things because it helped others understand. And Victor held that answer for a second longer than necessary, because it echoed something familiar, something he could not deny anymore. And as he straightened back up, his gaze moved to Naomi again, searching not for confirmation, but for truth. And Naomi did not offer explanation, did not soften the moment with words, because she knew something Victor was only beginning to understand. That truth does not need to be defended when it has already proven itself, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had led to this exact point. And as the room continued around them, unaware of the shift that had taken place, Victor Castellano stood still, no longer the man who had once believed he could decide the future of others with a single sentence, but someone now standing inside the result of his own past, realizing that what he had tried to prevent had not only survived, it had grown into something he could not ignore. And in that realization, there was no immediate reaction, no command, no resolution, only a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be shaped by power alone, but by something far more difficult to control, something that had been standing in front of him all along. There was a shift in the air that no one announced, but everyone instinctively adjusted to. A subtle tension that wrapped itself around the edges of the room, as if something unseen had quietly taken control of the moment. And Victor remained standing there, his posture still composed, but no longer distant, because distance required certainty, and certainty was the one thing he no longer possessed. And Ethan's presence beside Naomi seemed to anchor everything in place, not through force, but through quiet existence, the kind that does not demand recognition yet becomes impossible to ignore. And as the boy glanced up at Naomi again, asking softly if they were going to stay longer, his voice carried a familiarity that struck deeper than anything spoken before, because it was not just the tone, it was the rhythm, the natural cadence that mirrored something Victor knew too well. And Naomi nodded gently, her hand brushing lightly against Ethan's shoulder in reassurance, a simple gesture that carried years of unspoken promises. And Victor watched that interaction with an intensity that was no longer analytical. It was personal, though he had not yet allowed himself to fully accept what that meant. And when Ethan looked back at him, curiosity now clearer in his expression, there was a brief pause, the kind that exists when a child senses something important without understanding why. And Victor found himself speaking again, not out of habit, but out of something closer to instinct, asking where he had learned to speak so confidently. And Ethan answered without hesitation, explaining that his mother taught him to always say things clearly so people would listen. Because if you speak with respect, people should give it back. And those words settled into Victor's mind with a weight that felt disproportionate to their simplicity, because respect was something he had always commanded, never something he had been taught to earn. And now, hearing it framed through the voice of a child, it felt different. It felt earned in a way he had never considered. And Naomi did not interrupt, did not add to the moment, because she understood something Victor was only beginning to realize, that the boy did not need defending, did not need explanation. He stood as proof on his own, and as a nearby guest approached, attempting to draw Victor back into conversation, the interruption felt almost out of place, as if it belonged to a different version of the evening, one that had already passed. And Victor responded briefly, his attention returning immediately to the space in front of him, because everything else now seemed secondary. And as the seconds stretched, he finally spoke Naomi's name, not as a command, not as an acknowledgement of status, but as something closer to recognition. And she met his gaze with the same steady composure she had carried since the moment he walked toward her. And in that silence, there was no need to revisit the past with words, because both of them understood it fully. Every decision, every consequence, every path that had led them here. And Victor's voice, when it came again, was quieter than it had ever been, carrying none of the authority it once held, as he asked a question that revealed more than any statement could, asking how long she had known. And Naomi answered simply, without hesitation, without emotion, that she had known from the beginning. And that answer did not create shock. It created clarity, because it confirmed what Victor had already begun to understand, that everything he was seeing now had been real from the start, not something that formed later, not something shaped by chance, but something that had existed the moment he tried to deny it. And as that realization settled fully into place, the room around them seemed to quiet once more, not because people had stopped speaking, but because Victor had stopped hearing them. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about control, not about influence, not about outcomes. He was thinking about something far more difficult to measure, something that could not be undone or negotiated. And as Ethan stood there, unaware of the full weight of the moment, but completely present within it, Victor Castellano understood something he had never needed to face before, that the future he had once tried to erase had not only survived, it had grown stronger without him, and now stood in front of him asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply existing in a way that demanded to be acknowledged. And in that realization, there was no immediate answer, no clear path forward, only a quiet, undeniable truth that had finally taken its place. Time did not move forward in that moment. It deepened, settling around them like a weight that refused to lift, and Victor stood there with a stillness that no longer came from control, but from something far more unfamiliar, something closer to reflection, and his gaze moved once more between Naomi and Ethan, not searching anymore, but absorbing, as if he was trying to understand a story that had already been written without him. And for the first time, he did not try to interrupt it, because interruption required authority, and authority felt misplaced here, as if it no longer applied to what stood in front of him. And Ethan shifted slightly, his small hand adjusting the sleeve of his jacket again, a quiet habit that seemed insignificant but carried a rhythm Victor could not ignore. And he found himself noticing every detail now, the posture, the calm presence, the way the boy did not shrink under attention but also did not seek it. And those observations settled into something heavier than curiosity, something that felt undeniable. And yet Victor did not speak immediately, because words felt insufficient, as though anything he said would fall short of the truth that had already formed between them. And Naomi watched him closely, not with expectation, not with hope, but with a clarity that came from years of understanding that some moments arrive exactly as they are meant to, without needing to be forced. And she had long ago accepted that this day might come, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet intersection of paths that had once diverged completely. And now, standing here, she did not need to explain the years, did not need to recount the sacrifices or the nights that stretched longer than they should have, because none of that would change what Victor was seeing now, what he was beginning to understand on his own. And as the silence held, Ethan looked up at Naomi again, his voice soft as he asked if they were leaving soon because he had homework to finish. And the simplicity of that question landed in a way that nothing else had, because it carried a normalcy that felt almost foreign in the context of everything surrounding it. And Naomi nodded gently, her voice calm as she told him they would be leaving shortly. And Victor felt something shift again, not in the room, but within himself, because the idea of them leaving carried a finality he had not anticipated, a closing of something that had only just begun to open. And without fully deciding to, he spoke, his voice low but clear, asking if Ethan enjoyed school, and the boy nodded, explaining that he liked learning how things worked because it helped him understand people better. And that answer lingered in the air longer than expected, because it reflected something deeper than a child's curiosity. It reflected awareness, and Victor absorbed that quietly, realizing that the boy standing in front of him had been shaped not by circumstance alone, but by intention, by guidance, by a presence that had chosen to build rather than break. And his gaze returned to Naomi once more, and this time there was no distance left in it, only recognition, not just of who she was now, but of everything she had carried without him. And when he finally spoke her name again, it sounded different, stripped of its past meaning, carrying none of the authority it once held. And for a brief second, it was just a name, spoken by a man who was no longer certain of his place in the moment. And Naomi met that with the same steady calm, because she did not need him to define anything anymore. She had already built her world without his permission, and as the room continued to move around them, unaware of the shift that had taken place, Victor Castellano stood there understanding something he had never been forced to confront before. That power could influence many things, but it could not rewrite what had already been lived. And as Ethan took a small step closer to Naomi, instinctively aligning himself with the one person who had always been there, Victor realized that the space he now stood in was not one he could claim, not one he could command. It was one he had to earn. And that realization did not come with resistance. It came with a quiet, undeniable acceptance. And for the first time, The man who had once spoken with absolute certainty found himself standing in a moment where certainty no longer belonged to him, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something new, something that had not existed before, something that could only begin here. The moment did not break. It expanded, stretching quietly between them as if giving space for something new to take shape. And Victor felt it with a clarity that did not require explanation. Because for the first time in his life, he was not reacting from power. He was responding from something far more unfamiliar, something that required restraint. And as Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing up at Naomi with the quiet expectation of a child who trusted what came next, Victor understood that whatever this moment was becoming, it would not belong to him unless he approached it differently. And that realization settled into him with a weight that felt both humbling and necessary. And without rushing, without forcing the moment forward, he stepped back half a pace, not as a retreat, but as an acknowledgement, a silent recognition that he did not stand at the center of this story, not yet. And Naomi noticed it immediately, not the movement itself, but the meaning behind it, because men like Victor did not step back unless something had shifted deep beneath the surface, and she held his gaze for a brief second longer, not in challenge, not in defiance, but in quiet understanding, because she could see that he was beginning to understand something he had never been required to before. That presence alone did not grant belonging, and Ethan, sensing the subtle change in the air, looked between them with a small crease forming on his brow, not from fear, but from curiosity, as if he could feel the importance of the moment without knowing its full shape. And Victor noticed that too. The way the boy observed rather than reacted, the way he absorbed instead of retreating, and it reinforced something that had already taken root inside him, that this child had been raised with intention, with care, with a kind of strength that did not come from dominance, but from stability. And Victor's voice, when he spoke again, carried none of the sharpness that once defined it, only a quiet steadiness as he said that it was a strong name, that Ethan would grow into it. And the words were simple, but the tone carried something different, something that did not seek control or approval, only recognition. And Naomi did not respond immediately, because she understood that words were not the point, not anymore. What mattered was what stood behind them, and for a moment, there was nothing else said, only the quiet presence of three lives intersecting in a way that could not be undone. And then Ethan spoke, his voice calm but direct, asking Victor if he worked here. And the question, so innocent on the surface, landed with an unexpected weight, because it stripped away everything else, reducing Victor to a role that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with reputation, only presence. And Victor held that question for a second, considering it in a way he had never considered anything before, and then he answered simply, saying that he helped take care of things. And Ethan nodded as if that made sense, accepting the answer without question. Because children often do not need complexity, they recognize sincerity when it is there, and Naomi watched that exchange with quiet awareness, because she knew something Victor was only beginning to learn, that trust is not given through words, it is built through consistency, through time, through actions that prove themselves without needing to be declared. And as the room slowly returned to its rhythm around them, conversations rising again, glasses clinking softly in the background, Victor Castellano stood there no longer as the man who had once defined the direction of others with certainty, but as someone standing at the edge of something he did not yet fully belong to. And for the first time, he did not try to take control of it. He simply remained present, aware, and willing to understand what it would take to step into a place he had once tried to erase. And in that quiet shift, something changed that no one else in the room could see, but everything from that moment forward would be shaped by it. The evening did not end abruptly. It unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as if every second that passed carried them closer to something that had already been decided long before they stepped into that room. And Naomi felt it in the way Ethan's hand rested more firmly against hers, a subtle signal that he was ready to leave, that his world remained simple even as everything around him shifted in ways he could not yet understand. And she nodded gently, her voice soft as she told him they would head out. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away, Victor felt the movement before it fully happened, not as a physical action, but as a closing, a moment slipping beyond his reach before he had decided what to do with it. and for a brief second, instinct pushed forward, the old instinct to stop, to command, to redirect, but it did not take hold, because something stronger had replaced it, something quieter, something that understood that stopping them would not create connection. It would only repeat the past, and so instead, he spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough to reach them before they disappeared into the rhythm of the room, asking if he could walk them out. And the question itself carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was not a demand, it was a request, and Naomi paused, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge what that meant. And when she turned back toward him, her expression remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a recognition that this moment was no longer about what had been, but about what could be. And she gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just enough to allow the next step to exist, and Victor moved beside them, not ahead, not behind, but alongside, a position that felt unfamiliar yet necessary. And as they walked toward the exit, the sounds of the room softened behind them, replaced by the quieter rhythm of footsteps against polished floors, and Ethan glanced up again, his curiosity returning as he asked Victor if he always stayed this late at work. And Victor answered simply that sometimes he did, but tonight felt different, and the boy nodded as if that answer made sense, because children do not always need explanations. They accept what feels true in the moment. And as they reached the doorway, the cool air from outside slipped gently into the space, carrying a contrast to the warmth of the room they were leaving behind. And for a brief second, all three of them stood there, not moving forward, not stepping back, suspended between what had been and what might come next. And Victor looked at Naomi again, not searching, not questioning, but understanding something he had not understood before, that whatever happened from this point on would not be shaped by his past decisions, but by what he chose to do now. And Naomi met that understanding without needing to confirm it, because she had already built her life without waiting for this moment, without depending on it. And as Ethan stepped slightly forward, drawn by the open space beyond the door, Victor felt the final piece settle into place, not as a resolution, but as a beginning. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sincerity that had not existed before, asking if he could see them again. It was not framed as expectation, not as entitlement, but as possibility. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of everything that had led to this question. And Naomi did not answer immediately, because some answers are not given in words, they are given in time. And as she finally nodded once more, just slightly, just enough to leave the door open without fully stepping through it, Victor understood that this was not forgiveness, not yet. It was something far more valuable. It was a chance. And as they stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind them, the room they left behind seemed smaller, quieter, as if it had lost something it could not replace. And Victor remained standing there for a moment longer, not as the man who had once believed he controlled every outcome, but as someone who had just been given something he had never expected to earn. And for the first time, he did not try to define what came next. He simply accepted that it would have to be built, step by step, in a way he had never been required to before. And the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was open, waiting for what would come next. The night outside felt different from the warmth they had just left behind. The air cooler, quieter, as if the world itself had softened to match the moment that had just unfolded. And Naomi walked beside Ethan with the same steady pace she had carried for years, her steps grounded not in hesitation but in certainty, because everything she needed had already been built, not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent ones that had shaped a life no one could take from her. And Ethan glanced up at her as they reached the curb, his voice calm as he asked if the man inside was important. And Naomi paused for just a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the weight behind it. And she answered simply that he was someone who was still learning. And Ethan nodded as if that made sense, because in his world, people were not defined by titles or power, but by what they chose to become. And as a car approached, its headlights casting a soft glow across the pavement, Naomi opened the door for him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder before he climbed in. And for a moment, she stood there, looking out into the quiet street, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying something deeper, not regret, not anger, but a quiet understanding that the past had finally met the present, and it had not broken her. It had revealed her strength, and inside the building, Victor remained where he had stood after the door closed, the silence around him no longer empty, but reflective, because for the first time in his life, he was not surrounded by people who waited for his direction. He was alone with his own thoughts, and they did not move the way they used to. They did not organize themselves into plans or strategies. They lingered, forcing him to sit with something he had spent years avoiding. And as he finally moved, walking slowly toward the same doorway, his steps carried a different weight, not urgency, not control, but intention. And when he stepped outside, the cool air met him in a way that felt almost grounding, as if reminding him that this moment existed beyond the walls he controlled, and he saw them there, just for a second longer before the car door closed, before the engine started, before the distance began to form again. And he did not call out, did not interrupt, because he understood now that this was not a moment to claim. It was a moment to remember. And as the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the night, Victor stood still, watching until there was nothing left to see. And in that quiet space, he felt something settle inside him, not as regret, but as realization, that the words he had spoken 7 years ago had not defined the future. They had revealed who he was at the time. And now, standing here, he had the chance to become someone different, not through power, not through control, but through the choices he would make moving forward. And the silence that followed was not heavy. It was clear, open in a way that invited change, and for the first time, Victor Castellano did not turn away from it. He stood within it, understanding that respect was not something he could demand from the world. It was something he would have to earn, one moment at a time. And somewhere in the distance, a small boy leaned back in his seat, unaware of the shift he had created simply by existing, and a mother looked ahead with quiet strength, knowing that whatever came next, it would not be decided for her, because she had already proven that dignity does not wait for permission. And that night, without a single word spoken aloud, the world remembered what it looks like when power meets humility and chooses to change. A powerful story unfolds where a cold and dominant mafia boss once tried to control fate itself by threatening a vulnerable Black Maid, only to face the quiet consequences of his own words years later as their paths cross again in a moment filled with silence, recognition, and unspoken truth. This narrative explores the emotional depth of dark romance through the contrast between power and dignity, where a child becomes the living proof of resilience, and a woman stands unwavering after years of sacrifice, redefining what strength truly means in a world shaped by hierarchy and judgment. As the mafia boss confronts a reality he can no longer command, the story builds a compelling dark romance atmosphere that reveals how time transforms threats into reflection and control into humility, creating a deeply human journey that resonates beyond status and fear. The bond between mother and child stands at the heart of this dark romance, showing that love, patience, and quiet endurance can outlast even the most powerful attempts to erase them. While the transformation of a man who once believed himself untouchable adds a profound emotional layer to the unfolding events. Through cinematic storytelling and rich emotional layering, this dark romance captures the moment when past decisions return not with chaos, but with clarity, forcing the powerful to face what they once dismissed and reminding us that dignity cannot be taken, only revealed. In the end, this dark romance is not about dominance, but about recognition, where silence speaks louder than power and respect becomes something that must be earned, not demanded.